All right, so I want to build a little bit on the conversations I had had before, kind of thinking of some similar ideas, and this time talking about God and Daoism. Daoism is a belief system that can't really be put into words, that's part of it, but it's kind of the belief that there is a natural pattern that the universe is orchestrated by. There's a natural progression in development, a natural order by which everything in the universe operates. And we sort of want to let the universe unfold and progress according to that pattern. And a big part of this understanding is not enforcing our own predispositions, our own pretensions onto the world, basically. Not insisting that our preconceptions must be the way that reality actually is, and not trying to use our own effort to control or govern the world. We let things happen, and we don't really find it necessary to govern the outcome of a particular thing. You just let nature do what it was going to do anyway, and you keep from interfering with it, and that is the best way for things to bear fruit and for all of the organisms to develop. This idea is really strongly coincides with going with the flow, the metaphor of water. You flow like water around an object, and thus nothing can stand in the way of the river, of the water, because it just sort of flows naturally around everything else. So this idea of being loose and flexible and capable of bending and adapting to whatever we're faced with is really important, and kind of the nature of how Taoism says people should live, which to me seems like it corresponds an awful lot with this idea of turning the other cheek. I think it's really easy to suggest that that's sort of just submission or rolling over. That's what it sounds like on the face of it. But I think instead, if we understand it as sort of meeting opposition and challenges with this idea that we don't need to overcome or we don't need to sort of live our lives according to the idea that we need to dictate the result, that we're going to let things happen and we're going to respond to the reality of what's happening, and that we are going to be able to adapt to whatever's happening. I think that is a really helpful way to understand what Jesus is saying, and I think these things coincide very well together. And also the idea that there's sort of a natural order according to which everything happens. That sounds an awful lot like the word, the logos, which is the inherent design according to which the universe was created. Those sound totally the same to me. So in terms of an organizing principle which orchestrates the universe and according to which everything is created, that sounds like Jesus, the Word, the Logos before time, and what Daoism is describing as well. In a very similar way. I want to bring back what Daoism says to our conceptions of God, because what I've been saying before is that we can't impose a rational picture of what God must be onto who God is. We can't confuse our pictures with the totality of God, because there's always more for us to understand, and there's just always more that our picture can't fully encompass. And I relate that to Taoism because Taoism likewise says that all of the categories and the definitions we try to enforce in the world are necessarily, inherently incomplete. The world is a fluid, amorphous, gooey mass of continuously changing relationships and shifting processes, and we can use categories or systems to make sense of the world for convenience, but they can never really understand the reality, because the reality doesn't abide by our definitions of how the world is supposed to work. The point I want to make is specifically the act of trying to define something means we've contained it in that definition, and that means we've inherently lost what we're trying to talk about if we're talking about something which is beyond human conception. So in Taoism, there's this idea that the Tao that can be named is not the true Tao. It's the unbound, formless principle which gives rise to anything, but which is not any one particular thing. It's unspoken. And once you conceptualize it, or name it, or make it a definition, you've just made it something that you can point to and define, and that's definitely not what it is. You've put it in a box, and it doesn't go in a box. It can't go in a box. So the act of defining it means that you've come up with a false definition. And sort of the principle of definition, the principle of putting words to it, already means that you've departed from the actual nature of what you're trying to talk about. And you might have something which kind of approximates or points to what you're trying to define, but it can't capture the actual reality of it. We can't actually understand the infinite and ununderstandable principle. And likewise with God, once we've put God in a definition, we have, by definition, put some form of limit on him. If we can come up with a category in our minds or a conception, a snapshot, then we've sort of we've held God at arm's length so that we can sort of analyze and evaluate him and categorize him and compare him to other things, and really just kind of allow ourselves to observe him like we would observe beetles pinned down onto a table. And it's not just that our definitions will always be incomplete, it's that the very act of creating a strict definition which we can categorize implies that we can in some way understand that we've created a strict system in which God must operate. The very act of trying to define or paint a picture of what God is like is inherently contradictory to the idea that God is beyond our understanding and that God is infinite. A definition or a picture or a concept is inherently something limiting, and it puts God at a distance from us through our intellectualization of him. And I think that's true for the good as well, for morality, for how we should live life and what we should do. We can't make a complete picture of it. We keep finding ways that our definitions of good don't fully capture all of what it means to be moral or to live well. And we need new definitions, not because the old definitions were incorrect, but because when we try to come up with every possible scenario, we're probably going to leave things out. Now, there's one more way that I think following God matches with Daoism really, really well. When you're following the Tao, when you're living life according to the correct pattern, there's a really strong idea of not sort of aligning to principles you know by memory and not overthinking things. So a strong sense of sort of muscle memory and going with the current and moving with the flow. There's numerous examples of people who are just so great in Daoism, these Taoist sages, and they're just ordinary people who get lost in doing something extraordinarily well. There's a swimmer and a butcher and just very simple people who are living without trying to make too much sense out of everything. I see it as like, as I said last time, sort of getting lost in the dance of it. You are in the process of it, you're experiencing, you're living it, and you are taking part in this motion. And in doing so, you, to a certain extent, kind of forget yourself, and you forget the instructions that you're trying to live by, and you take part of this process, and thus, while actively doing it, you're experiencing it quantitatively from the inside. But it is not based on a definition you came up with in your head, and it is not based on sort of rationalizing out what you're supposed to do and then just living according to these conclusions that you've created about yourself. And Prince of Egypt has something to say about this. They have a really nice portrayal of joining the dance for God, I think.
And though you never know all the steps, you must learn to join the dance. You must learn to join the dance.
I think that's just a really beautiful portrayal, living life through heaven's eyes. You pursue excellence to the point that you forget that you were trying to chart out what it meant to pursue excellence in the first place. You get lost in the dance and you live your life according to the illumination of these principles of stepping into the sunbeam. And you sort of operate through this qualitative understanding where you're always desiring to understand more and to do more and to create more knowledge than you had before. But you don't believe that God or the way God has for us to live can be contained in a set of principles or ideas.